Good evening. My name is Alice Simon. I'm an economics professor in the economics department. I'm also co-director of the Walter Monte Center for Economics, Business, and Entrepreneurship. It is my absolute pleasure to welcome all of you to the 9th annual Economic Outlook Conference. We are very pleased to have three wonderful distinguished speakers with us this evening. I would like to welcome the Ohio Wesleyan community, faculty, staff, students. I would like to welcome the members of the Delaware community, and also to everybody online who is looking right now during web stream, hello. It is my pleasure to introduce the president of our university, Dr. Rock Jones.
Thank you, Alice, and it's also my pleasure to welcome all of you this evening. Each year we look forward to this annual Economic Outlook Conference, though in my 4 years, and now in my 5th year here at Ohio Wesleyan, they have not always been the years with the best economic outlook. I'm eager to hear what we might hear from our panelists this evening, now 4 years into the recession, about potential recovery and about what the future holds. This is always an exciting evening for us for a number of reasons. First, because it allows us to bring to campus people with expertise and experience in analyzing the various forces within the marketplace that impact the economy and that through economic impact each one of us. We know that these are no longer provincial forces, but rather global forces, and as we gather this evening, we gather in the context of a global economy with far more variables at play than might have been the case at an earlier time. And so this time each year for us to set aside an evening to listen together and to visit together with experts from other places as we consider the current indicators in the economy and anticipate what the future might hold always is important to us. It's also important to us because it gives us an opportunity, as Dr. Simon noted, to welcome to campus a number of people from the community of Delaware and from throughout Central Ohio who each year join us for this Economic Outlook Conference. We welcome you to campus, and we're especially happy to have you for this conference, which is a part of the larger program of the Voltamati Center for Economics, Business, and Entrepreneurship. The Voltamati Center hosts a number of lectures and programs to which the public is invited each year, and I hope that you will remain aware of those programs and find opportunities to participate in others of the lectures and conferences and programs hosted by the Voltamati Center each year. In addition to the programs that are open to the public, the Voltamati Center provides extraordinary opportunities for our students, both students who are involved directly in the economics program, but students also from other disciplines on the campus to interact with experts from a number of areas of interest throughout the course of their time at Ohio Wesleyan. And in many ways, the Voltamati Center exemplifies our commitment to a liberal arts curriculum that allows students in every discipline to make connections between theory and practice, between classroom learning and experiences in the real world, and to do that in the global context of the global economy in which we live and work today. So we welcome you to this event, and we hope to see you at future events as well. It's my pleasure now to introduce the moderator for our panel this evening, Dr. Goran Skospels, who is an assistant professor of economics here at Ohio Wesleyan. Goran came to Ohio Wesleyan after earning his PhD at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, where he won an award for excellence in undergraduate teaching by graduate teaching assistants. Dr. Skospels' teaching focuses include economics of transition, macroeconomics, developmental economics, international economics, research methods, and economic principles. His research deals with institutional changes in post-communist countries of Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union, banking and credit, and small business finance. Here at Ohio Wesleyan, Dr. Skospels has taken up the course of Principles of Economics, National Income and Business Cycles, Research Methods in Economics, and Economic Systems, and for a number of years now he has served as the moderator of this panel and of this gathering. So Goran, we thank you for your leadership and we look forward to the evening. Thank you.
So I would like to introduce the three of our panelists, distinguished panelists tonight. The first presentation is going to be by Dr. James Bang, who is an assistant professor of economics at St. Ambrose University. He earned his bachelor degree from Truman State University in Kirksville and his master's and PhD from one of the best universities in the world, University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. By the way, we went to graduate school together. His research is primarily on immigration, on institutional economics, economic growth, discrimination, and some work in armed conflict. James is going to give us more of an international view, outlook of the international economy. Second presenter is going to be Dr. Pedro Amaral, who is a senior research economist at the Federal Reserve Bank in Cleveland. He's a native of Lisbon, Portugal, and he earned his bachelor's degree from Universidade Católica Portuguesa and a doctorate in economics from University of Minnesota. And prior to joining the bank, he was a professor at Southern Methodist University. Pedro is going to give us an outlook of the national economy. Last, we have Kenny McDonald, who is the Chief Economic Officer of Columbus 2020, is going to give us a local perspective or local outlook. He received his Bachelor's of Science in Business Administration from Dickinson State University and a Master's of Public Administration from Georgia Southern University, and he holds the professional designation of Certified Economic Developer, awarded through the International Economic Development Council. As I said, he's going to give us a local outlook. The format is going to be each presenter is going to talk for about 10, 12, maybe 15 minutes. After all three are done with their presentations, I'm going to ask them whether they have any questions for each others to get them to converse, maybe some conservative topics. And then we are going to open up the floor for questions. Please join me in welcoming our panel, and I hope you're going to have an enjoyable evening.
Okay, Goran called me a couple months ago and asked me to be a part of this, and of course, him being a good friend of mine from grad school, I couldn't say no, and I was very honored to accept the invitation, and I'm very grateful for it. I'm honored to be here. I'd like to thank the president of the university and everyone involved with the center that made this program possible, and try to get underway and keep my remarks brief so that Goran and the rest of the audience has plenty of time for questions. The focus of what I want to talk about today is going to start by kind of looking at what's been going on in the United States and look at how different events in the United States, namely the recession and the financial crisis that we've been going through, has impacted the rest of the world. Talk about how some of those things are linked to some of the international linkages that we've seen growing over the last 30 or 40 years, and then kind of look at how that kind of has affected our economy over the long run, and maybe a few conclusions at the end. So where I want to start here is just kind of looking at what's been going on with the United States economy. And so what I've done here is I've prepared some slides to kind of give us a comparison of what's been happening to world output measured by GDP leading up to and since the financial crisis and the recession that began in 2008 and really kind of hit world markets in 2009. So what I've done here is to make things a little bit more comparable graphically. I've made it so that all of the GDP numbers have been normalized so that the base year essentially is 2008. So in 2008, everybody's equal to 100. right? So the bigger economies don't just have really big numbers, and it's kind of hard to see the changes over time. So keep in mind here that 2008 for the U.S. is equal to 100. So the U.S. goes down to about 97 or something like that in 2009. That's like a 3% drop. And then we've kind of been slowly growing out of that recession ever since. Okay, and so we kind of start to look at some of the different regions. Probably the region that's been least affected by the recession in the United States has been East Asia, right? Because East Asia has been, we're looking at China and some of these robustly growing economies in Asia. They've kind of been able to come through the recession pretty strong. There's a little bit of a decline in growth, but they never actually shrank the way the U.S. and other regions did. But as we look at some of the other regions in the world, we look at Africa. And Africa has kind of gone through a dip in their GDP, but they've recovered actually pretty robustly. So, one of the optimistic things that's going on in the world right now is that, for the last decade or so, Africa, and especially sub-Saharan Africa, has begun to kind of, break free economically and start to experience some growth. And while they did have a bit of a hiccup in 2009 with a little bit of shrinkage in their economy, they've actually recovered from it rather quickly because there's so much potential for gain in that region of the world. Similarly for Latin America has a lot of countries that have been growing pretty robustly. Brazil and other areas of the world that are attracting a lot of investment. They kind of follow a similar pattern as sub-Saharan Africa. And the Middle East, while it had a pretty sharp decline relative to sub-Saharan Africa and Latin America, they've rebounded pretty quickly as well. But then when we look at Europe and Central Asia, especially Eastern Europe and Central Asia, which is what we're looking at here, they've had a pretty deep recession. And while they have recovered, they're still not too much ahead of where the U.S. is relative to where they were in 2008, right? So basically the idea that I'm trying to present with these graphs is that kind of the adage that we have in international economics, which is that when the world sneezes, when the U.S. sneezes, the world catches a cold, right? So what we see is that the U.S. has a decline in its GDP, and usually the rest of the world has a slightly magnified impact on theirs. And so what I want to do is I want to spend just a few minutes kind of talking about why that is, and then kind of turning it back to how those different factors have influenced the United States. Okay. When we look at the rest of the world, there's pretty big drop. And then when we exclude East Asia, which has had extremely robust growth over the last 10 to 20 years, it's even a little bit more of an exaggeration in terms of how the U.S. recession has impacted the rest of the world. So I want to kind of think for a minute about why is this. Well, the main reason that some of this happens is because the international linkages between countries are much greater than they may have been, say, 30 or 40 or 50 years ago. And so one of the things that did fall sharply during the course of the recession was world trade. World trade fell very sharply, and this kind of led some different people in the business and finance community to get a little bit worried that there was going to be, that the financial crisis would lead to a new wave of protectionism and something similar to what we saw during the Great Depression. But those types of consequences thankfully haven't materialized, and so the question is, why is that? Well, one of the reasons is that when we look at the sharp drop in trade that we experienced during the recent financial crisis, a lot of that does not have to do with an exaggerated decline in overall economic activity, but to a certain extent how we actually measure trade. right? And how we have traded over the last 20 or 30 years compared with how we traded in 1933 when we were going through the Great Depression, okay? So one of the big differences is that a lot of the trade has come about due to vertical integration, firms that kind of trade components up the supply chain. And so when demand for the final good goes down, that kind of destroys a lot of trade transactions from where the raw materials are produced all the way through as the components are traded across borders, and then some value is added and then traded again. Because the accounting issue is that we don't actually measure trade in terms of the actual value added that's produced in a particular country. We measure trade in terms of the gross value of what crosses the border. So to give you an example, we import an iPhone that maybe has a $200 or $300 sticker price, and all of that $200 or $300 sticker price gets counted as an import from China. But when you actually look at the value added, the actual value added of that iPhone that's coming from China is only about $6 or $8. Okay, so the actual components and the value of the iPhone that was actually part of China's GDP in terms of actual production, value-added production, it's a very small percentage of what actually gets counted as trade. And so when you destroy a little bit of trade, it kind of gets magnified down the supply chain. And thankfully, the recession hasn't led to more protectionism. So when we look at exports, they had a really sharp drop. We lost about 20% of world trade, yet as the supply chain has begun to recover, so too have the trade volumes. Another international linkage is immigration. This is one of the particular areas of interest for me because I research it. But when we look at immigration, immigration has been extremely resilient to the recession. In other words, the U.S. has kind of had a downturn, but that hasn't turned people off from migrating to the United States, at least in terms of total foreign-born population. But one factor related to migration that has been impacted pretty strongly is remittances. These are portions of immigrants' income that they send home to their families. And those financial transfers have fallen from about $450 billion in 2008 to about $420 billion in 2009. And so when we add immigration and remittances to our graph, we do see a little bit of a stronger impact where this decline in world trade or decline in U.S. GDP that happened from 2008 to 2009 kind of gets transmitted to the international market through trade, through remittances, and finally, through foreign direct investment. Right? So part of the whole idea of having these vertically integrated supply chains is that this is coming as a result of having more globalized companies, more multinational corporations. So one of the things that we've seen through the financial crisis is less foreign direct investment to sub-Saharan Africa, less foreign direct investment to Latin America, the Middle East, and Eastern Europe. And in some of those cases, the foreign direct investment has picked up, right? But in other places, curiously enough, the Middle East, that foreign direct investment hasn't picked back up. And so, that has implications in terms of, employment and jobs and economic performance throughout those regions as well. Okay, and Eastern Europe and Central Asia had a 70% drop in FDI going into their country, going from 2008 to 2009, which is pretty substantial. Eastern Europe and Central Asia had the biggest drop and have recovered the slowest. And interestingly, if we were to add East Asia to this, FDI to East Asia has also been falling, but it was already falling before the crisis. So it is not actually, FDI hasn't really had a strong impact on reducing East Asia's GDP like it has some of the other regions, because that was already kind of built into how those variables were trending before the crisis. Okay, so when we look at this, we see a decline for sub-Saharan Africa. I don't have data after 2009, but we have a drop in GDP, or in FDI. Same for Latin America, although there's a slight recovery there. the Middle East, things have been going down pretty sharply. And then when we add Eastern Europe and Central Asia, which coincidentally enough was the region that was the most impacted by the drop in GDP, FDI seems to be having a pretty strong impact for that part of the world. Okay, so they lost about 70% of their FDI from 2008 to 2009. They continued to lose more of their FDI from 2009 to 2010, and only now from 2010 onward has that begun to kind of rebound and pick back up. Okay. But when we look at East Asia, we add East Asia to this, they were already going down. So they were already coming down before the beginning of the crisis in 2008, right? So their FDI has been plummeting, but it's not nearly as influential on their overall economy because that was already part of the trend, that it was already falling prior to the crisis. Okay. And so what I want to do next, before I get into some of my own conclusions, is I want to kind of tie that back into how all of these different linkages might impact you as students, and if you want to look at the slides on my conclusions, you can. But what I want to talk to for a second is, how does this impact you as students at Ohio Wesleyan University? Well, one of the things that we predict with trade is that the sectors that your country becomes more specialized in, it becomes better and better to be a supplier of resources in that sector. So if we're going to be exporting in sectors that require a lot of skilled labor, which a lot of people have said that we do, then what that would mean is that the real incomes of people who are skilled are going to go up, right? And the unfortunate consequence of that is that the real incomes of people with fewer skills is going to go down relative to the rest of the population. And so what that means for you is that the returns to the education that you're receiving while you're at Ohio Wesleyan or other universities in the region, that's increasing, right? And so some people have looked at the returns to education, and these have been widening, and they've kind of estimated them to be somewhere in the ballpark of, over the course of your entire lifetime career, to be somewhere around 2 million to 2.5 million projected over your entire career. So, and getting bigger. So there's a huge impact of trade in terms of the returns to education, and that influences you positively. So just to conclude and wrap up quickly, international linkages are important. Okay, these are going to have a strong impact in terms of what happens in one part of the world impacting the rest of the world. Some of these statistics we need to interpret with caution, because in the case of trade, there may be double counting involved and things like that. And finally, some implications are that global institutions have been important in terms of kind of cushioning the blow of the impact of the financial crisis on the rest of the world. Financial development does matter. Things that do help to increase international financial flows are an important source of development in many countries. And political institutions do also matter, in the sense that, as countries become more polarized and special interest groups gain leverage, that doesn't seem to help the process. So I'll end there. That's my time. Thank you.
Thank you all for coming out. I want to thank Ohio Wesleyan, President Jones, and the Walter Monte Center and the Econ Department, Alice and Gore in particular, for contacting me. So I'm obviously happy to be here from an institutional standpoint, representing the Cleveland Fed. But I'm also happy on a personal note, talking to faculty and students here. It's obvious that the university sort of embraces multiculturalism as one of its values. And as a foreigner in the US, that's particularly close to me, so I'm very happy to be here. Now, although I'm a foreigner, I'm going to try to convince you that I know a little bit about the US economy. which is the subject that brings me here today. So let me start with what is now a truism, is that coming out of the recession, the U.S. economy is expanding at a very slow pace. And let me put some numbers on that. So in particular, if you look at it, so this is quarterly GDP numbers since the bottom of the recession, the trough of the recession here. And we've basically averaged, and you can see up there, a 2.2 quarterly growth, annualized growth rates through the recovery. And you can see that in the average post-war recovery, the pace has been roughly double, 4.3. That's that 4.3 number over there. So it's been a particularly lackluster recovery. The fact that we never really went above 4% at all means that we're doing actually worse than we're doing on average, meaning recoveries and recessions, everything accounted for. In particular, we should be doing well since we're recovering, and we're not. Let me put a little bit of perspective on this sort of upswing, if we could call it that. So on the red there, we have our current cycle. So this is measured from the peak now, the peak preceding the recession. We have our current cycle on the red. On the blue, I think this blue, we've got our average cycle, and then those bands sort of represent how well we did and how badly we did in all cycles, so the range. And you know, we've broken the range, we're way below down there. And again, this is in terms of GDP. Now, we'll talk a little bit more about what might be causing this protracted recovery. Obviously, the fact that we're coming in, you know, it's not been a regular recession. It's been the largest recession since the Great Depression. And naturally, things are coming back a lot slower. It was associated with a financial crisis. So some researchers out there, namely associated with the names of Reinhardt and Rogoff, think that recessions associated with financial crisis are particularly deep, and they take a long time in terms of recovery. Colleagues of mine, Joe Aubrick and Michael Bordo, tend to disagree. So when they look overall at U.S. recessions and they look at which ones were associated with financial crisis, they don't see. I mean, they do agree that recessions associated with financial crisis are large and deep, but they don't see any difference in terms of recoveries. What they find is that recessions that are associated with balance sheet problems for banks and households, in particular I'm thinking about the housing market slump now, tend to have very protracted recoveries like the one we're experiencing now. And of course, the repairing of households' balance sheet is at the forefront of what's going on in this recovery. Household, in terms of thinking of household debt to disposable income ratios, at the peak, this was something like 130%. We've recovered somewhat. We're now down to 110, but there's still some work need to be done. Obviously, household spending has felt it a lot, and being the largest component in GDP, as households recover and repair their balance sheet, they're trying to save, they're not spending as much. So you can see here, this is sort of the same picture that I had for GDP, but now for household spending, so consumer spending. You can see sort of the same picture. Household spending is such a big component of GDP that's going to drag GDP along. So when you look at pictures like this, I want you to see sort of household saving and deferring consumption, and that's what's basically sort of mechanically, and then we can talk about what are the deeper reasons, but mechanically that's what's sort of making this recession so protracted. It's true that investment hasn't been particularly good as of late, but in general, and here I'm just fixing on a particular category of business investment, business fixed investment here, just to show you that coming out of the recession, it was a big recovery. It was a speedy, strong recovery in terms of investment, but we're lagging kind of late. And if you notice in my first slide, I had that, this last quarter, so quarter 2 of this year, basically we grew at 1.3%, just pretty poor, pretty paltry. One of the reasons we grew so poorly was that investments sort of weakening at this point. That's why, and I'll talk a little bit about what we forecast for the future. That's why our immediate forecast, our 6-month forecast, is not going to be a very strong one for the U.S. economy, but these things will go away in sort of the medium run here. Now, obviously, because GDP growth has been subdued, so has employment growth been subdued here. And the sort of employment numbers, now with the election coming, sort of numbers that are on the mind of everywhere here. So these are numbers from from the establishment, the payroll survey. Basically, they tell you every month how many payrolls numbers have increased or not. You know, the recession, they were decreasing, obviously. So it's not a nice picture. You know, we'd like to see a stronger recovery in payroll numbers. So the 3-month average, that's the red line over there, we're about 146. So now there's a question of how many jobs do we need to keep adding every month just to keep up with population growth, et cetera. And when we look, and in particular in this last release of the unemployment rate, which is sort of the other side of the picture here. Here I'm talking about employment. We can also think about the unemployment rate. Our unemployment rate is still elevated at 7.8%. But if you take sort of a longer time perspective here, I want you to look at those peaks over there. Right, so unemployment tends to lag GDP a little bit, so the unemployment peaks a little bit after the recession. And what we see over here is that our recovery in terms of unemployment hasn't been bad at all from a sort of perspective that takes into account the last 2 recessions here. Meaning the speed of decrease there for the wonks out there, the first derivative of that line, it's pretty high, it's pretty steep compared to the other two recessions that we experimented. And this contrasts, obviously, and here I'm just going to go back, with sort of the lackluster numbers on employment, the difference being behavior of the labor force, right? So employment's just a number, right, an absolute number. When we're measuring unemployment rate, we're thinking of unemployment divided by the labor force. And what's been happening is that a lot of discouraged unemployed workers, job seekers, are just leaving the labor force. And that obviously lowers the unemployment rate sort of mechanically, but that doesn't mean there's a real improvement in the economy. So we got to be worried about that, sort of distinguishing between what's employment, what's unemployment, and what are the factors affecting it. Something that the Fed looks real close at is inflation. And I bet we'll talk a little bit more about inflation in the Q&A and the panel debate here. But so inflation has been sort of pretty subdued. Here I'm going to look at the PCE price index. That's an index that comes from personal consumption expenditures. I'll talk about the more well-known CPI in just a little bit. But as you can see, and here I have both the sort of a headline number, so the overall number for inflation, then core that excludes food and energy. And as you can see, those numbers are pretty low. So the Fed has this mandate for low and stable prices, and there you are. You know, they're below 2%. So going in, inflation's not. I mean, it's a concern. It's obviously always a concern, but it seems to be under control. The same when we look at the CPI. So that's a consumer price index. It's just a basket of goods urban consumers buy all the time. And there we have some alternative measures, but I want you to focus on the fact that they're all showing the same thing. So one's the core CPI, so what urban consumers buy except food and energy again. And what we've done there is we computed 2 different measures that basically sort of trim outliers. You know, every month goods prices bounce up and down, but we want to take out the outliers because they don't mean a lot. They're just noise. So that's that 16% trimmed mean CPI. And obviously the median CPI. Here we're just looking at the prices that are chasing at the median, so 50% above, 50% below. But all the behavior leads you to conclude that inflation's been pretty low. Okay? So I want to keep that in mind as we go along. Moreover, and again, something that we at the Fed look particularly close at is, so inflation is low now, but what do agents in the economy think inflation is going to be in the future, right? Because that's a reflection of how do consumers, agents, et cetera, see the Fed doing its job. So our maintained goal is we're going to give you 2% inflation in the future, right? If people don't believe that, we have a problem, right? So we like to keep tabs on these things, right? So this is the Michigan survey of consumers, and there we see there, so 5 to 10 years ahead and just 1 year ahead. So you can see that the 1 year ahead measures so pretty volatile, and there's a lot of noise in that measure, okay? But both are pretty contained. You see some little blips associated with sort of QE announcements and things like that. But basically, wherever there's a blip, it comes down again. So we like to say that sort of inflation expectations are well anchored. That's like Fed jargon for we don't have a problem with that. Okay. So let me now sort of, you know, so this is sort of a perspective on where is the U.S. economy been, and now let me give you a perspective on what do we think. And now, I'm going to turn to sort of what are the FOMC's official forecasts, whereas, what I've been talking about right now is my own views and don't necessarily reflect those of the FOMC or the Federal Reserve System. But these are sort of official views, okay? So what do we think is going to happen? And here I'm showing you measures from the forecasts by FOMC participants. So I'm including sort of the board of governors, there's 7 governors, and all the regional presidents, there's 12 of them. So there's 19 people having inputs onto this. And those measures there, the range is obviously, different people have different views. That's the range of their views. The central tendency excludes the 3 sort of extreme, the 3 people in each extreme. So on the total, there's 13 people in that central tendency here. So basically what we think is going to happen is there's going to be short-term weakness and long-term gains. But notice that even those long-term gains, in light of the numbers that I showed you before, was a regular recovery, that 4.4 average. We never really, at most, we get to close to 4 over there. So it's not going to be one of those door-busting recoveries. It's going to be a mild recovery, but it's going to get better. Unemployment, we're predicting it's going to take 3 years to sort of fully normalize the situation in the job market in terms of the unemployment rate. When I say normalize, I'm thinking of sort of a long-term, sort of natural unemployment rate of around 6%. Okay? Obviously, the last report was a great surprise for us. So over here, you can see that in September, and that sort of FOMC meeting in September was before the latest job report that brought down the unemployment rate to 7.8%. That wasn't something we were predicting at all. So we thought it was going to be at 8%. So we're now down to 7.8 already. But we think it's going to take a while for the labor market to normalize, in 3 years. Okay. In terms of inflation, we think it's going to remain stable. And this is very important when we conduct monetary policy. We want to, we talk, the economy absorbs what we say and what we do, and then we, get it as feedback and we look at what inflation expectations are. Okay? We think right now that inflation is not going to be above that 2% target throughout the foreseeable horizon. Okay? Let me tell you something about how these forecasts are made. So each participant, each regional Fed, like for example at the Cleveland Fed, we have a forecast, and our forecast is predicated on what we think is appropriate monetary policy, not on what necessarily is the FOMC's official monetary policy. So for example, if a president's or a governor's view on what appropriate monetary policy differ, this forecast is going to reflect that, okay? So otherwise all the forecasts would be the same. If the inputs were all the same, then, if you're using the same models, the outputs will all be the same. But the inputs are not all the same, and that's why they differ. Going forward, what are the major headwinds that the U.S. economy is facing? And this is something that we can talk about in the panel. I'm sure you guys will have a lot of questions to ask about it. But the major, it's not big news, the major things we've got coming or that are impeding our swift rise to the top are the fiscal cliff. I'm sure you guys are going to go home and watch the vice presidential debate. I know I am. I'm going to be interested in listening to what they have to say about what's going to happen in January next year as we face the fiscal cliff. We can, again, like I said, I got to keep it short here, but we can talk about, what is the fiscal cliff, what's going to happen, what's not going to happen. We can talk about all that in the Q&A in the panel. And obviously the situation in Europe. So as you know, Europe's facing sort of a different crisis from what we're facing, sort of a debt crisis. But that has only, not only impacts in terms of trade, as Jim was saying, but also impacts on what financial intermediation, how financial intermediation happens in the world. European banks are very important intermediates of U.S. savings. So the problem is not only that we hold, say, Greek bonds or Spanish bonds or something like that. There's not a lot of that anymore going around. But the problem is a lot of money market funds, a lot of your money is intermediated by European banks. I bet you didn't know that. No, those guys, they don't know. They do have your money, and if they get into trouble, the U.S. economy is going to suffer because of that. So that's a big channel. That's a channel that's arguably more important than the trade channel, which is, I'm not going to say it's very limited, but at most a recession in Europe is going to mean like a 0.5% to 1% fall in U.S. GDP. Whereas if we really get into financial intermediation troubles, that can mean a lot more of a decrease in GDP.
Can I just? Is that okay? Good evening. So I have no charts. Applause. Come on. And I'm not an economist. I'm both too dumb and too optimistic to hold that title. I really do appreciate the work that these gentlemen do, however, because the data is a constant reminder of the work that we have to do. I'm Kenny McDonald. I'm the Chief Economic Officer of something called Columbus 2020, which is an economic development organization for this region. And I represent very proudly Delaware County and institutions like Ohio Wesleyan as partners in our effort to build our economy here in Central Ohio. And our organization is a public-private partnership. It has been operational for less than 2 years. And so my comments may be tethered to how long we've been working at this, but I'll try to give you a little historical perspective as well. An economic developer is somebody who works sort of on the front lines of the economy. So we're working with the communities, and I see some of our economic development folks in the audience tonight, Dan and Gus from here in Delaware County. We're working with companies every day, both looking at our region to add jobs and capital to our economy, and we're working more importantly with those companies that are already here, helping them either deal with issues in their industry or the economy, or helping them go global, or helping them with expansion plans that they may have here or elsewhere around the world. And I always find this interesting. I was very fortunate to be invited to the White House about 2 months ago, and we got word that they were going to invite 50 regions to come to the White House and provide perspective about what's going on the ground to the White House staff. And the intergovernmental relations people were setting all this up at the White House, and we hurriedly, through our national association, put together a great group of people. We had 49 regions and local areas from around the country gather from all of the major areas, from swing states and non-swing states and great metropolitan areas, really in literally every corner of our country. And when we got there, they brought out an economist, and he began by saying that we had a recession in 2007. And we all appreciated that information very, very much. But the fact is that our job is to play the hand we're dealt every day. And this is what we're doing at Columbus 2020. Our effort is very comprehensive, and I'll touch on these things because it's instructive about how I see the future. First and foremost, we want to work with our local companies. So there's roughly 40,000 businesses in this region. Less than 1,200 of those have more than 100 employees. Our organization and our economic development efforts focus on those that build the foundation. Our headquarters, our R&D facilities, our manufacturing facilities, both small and large. Those companies that give us a chance to grow our economy and grow Main Street. All of the retail we have is dealt off of building that foundation. So we work really hard to grow that foundation and make it stronger. And one of the things we've been doing is going out and talking directly to the companies across this region. This year alone, we went and talked to 400 companies for 1 or 2 hours each, and we've done this a little bit with my staff and a lot with our local economic development partners. Go out and ask them, how's it going? Not only can we provide services to you, but what challenges do you have? You learn a lot when you have those conversations. It's great research, and it helps to fuel things that happen here with these gentlemen, but it's very instructive to our staff. What we find is about 1/3 of those are expanding. And more often than not, people would add more jobs if they could find people who had the skills to work, could pass drug test, and could come to show up to work every day. And so we walk away both energized that 1/3 of those companies we call on actually are hiring people or would like to hire people, and we walk away with a very sobering challenge that we're producing a product and a workforce that is unable to meet the needs of those companies every day. So we're working on both of those ends. So number one, take care of our own customers. Number two, get out around the world and tell the Columbus story. I moved from Charlotte, North Carolina to the Columbus region for 2 primary reasons. Number one, this area has a better ability to put together a public-private partnership than I'd seen in a long time, and I would argue that especially the private sector support that we have is stronger than any other region and any of the peers that I have working and running organizations in peer organizations around the country. This is really critical. The second reason I moved here is that this is an undervalued product. It's like taking over a company with a wonderful product that hasn't had any salespeople. So part of my job is to get our team out around the world. So somewhere every week we are talking to growing companies. Our team leaves for Japan tomorrow. They'll have 23 meetings with companies all over Japan. They'll split into 2 teams once they land in Tokyo, and they'll be making calls on a host of companies that are already in this region for 2 reasons. Number one is to say thank you for your investment in creating jobs in our region, and your relationship is really important. Is there anything else we can do for you? And number two, we're talking to growing companies from Japan, looking at the U.S. market, at where are they going to make their investment. If they're going to develop a sales office or a manufacturing plant, where is it they're going to do that? We're not the only ones calling on them. There's probably a dozen communities been there before us, but we better be in the room if we're going to ask for the order. And so our team is doing that on a very regular basis, and that has never happened in the Columbus region. So we're taking that off the table and making that part of our strategy. Finally, we are working our tails off to connect the dots. We have 9 incubators across this region. We have dozens and dozens of organizations with work with entrepreneurs, and very little connectivity, at least across our region, between those organizations. So connecting people who want to start companies or who have started companies with the resources that are local and state and academic to help them accelerate their businesses. And the final piece is that to connect them with capital. There is capital in our area. Ohio has one of the largest angel networks in the whole country, if not the largest. We've got to connect these people with money. Now, we can't always do that. It's still a huge challenge, but we've got to be organically growing our companies. If you look around our region and look at our major employers, they started with 1 or 2 people. Cardinal Health and Limited Brands are probably the 2 finest and largest examples of that, but there are many, many more, Wendy's and others, that started with an idea and a concept and grew into some of the biggest companies in the world. And we need to be growing those right now, today, in our economy, but it's up to us to connect the dots. And then finally, when we're out talking after we've talked to hundreds of companies locally and we've talked to maybe thousands of companies around the world, we owe it to our policymakers and those running our institutions to tell them what is required by those companies to be successful on our soil. And we're starting to connect the dots there as well. And we're trying to help our policymakers and those that are building the workforce to increase the connectivity there. Just a few numbers for you when you talk about our outlook. So from January of 2010 to today, this region has gained about 40,000 jobs. And we're one of very few places that can throw those kinds of numbers around. We have very, very positive momentum. Recent articles in Time magazine and lots of coverage that we've got around the world. When people show up to cover the election from our region, as we've had so many people do over the last several months, a lot of them walk away with a business message and walking away when they go back to Port Columbus thinking, this area is a little more vibrant than I thought. And it's hard for them to find the woe is us story in not only Ohio, but particularly in Columbus, Ohio. Maybe more importantly for the outlook, over 200 companies have announced over 25,000 jobs projected for the next 3 years, and close to $2 billion of capital investment that's going to happen here. So our efforts are paying off. This bottle, I'll steal your bottle for a second, is a great example of a company that we just landed in Gahanna. So the company that invented the small cap and this ribbed bottle that takes out almost 70% of the plastic that you used to have in a plastic water bottle is now going to build a $50 million facility in Gahanna. And they did that because we had a connection to them, and we competed for the deal, and it's going to happen in Gahanna, and it's not going to happen in Kentucky or Indiana or Pennsylvania, where it easily could have been. And that's what we're trying to do for this region. So the great people we have going to school here and the other 40-plus universities that we have across this region can become an engineer for that company or become a line worker for that company or an accountant for that company right here where they went to school. And that's critically important for our area long term. The unemployment numbers here are getting better. As you know, Delaware County, I think, is at 4.9% now. I'll give you that's a great thing to have happen, but it's not enough, as far as I'm concerned. Our clients look at that in a very interesting way. They think that's actually getting to be too low. They're worried that they're not going to be able to get workers when a county like this gets to 4.9%. So that's an interesting sort of double-edged sword that we deal with constantly. Finally, I'll leave you with a couple of thoughts about our challenges. So I really believe that our future is in our own hands, that we have all the levers that we possibly need to make our economy very, very, very strong here in the Columbus region and continue to grow this region exponentially larger than it ever has been before. But I don't think every region is going to make that recovery. Either they don't have the levers to pull, the institutions or the assets, or more critically, they don't have the leadership with their private sector and their public sector and their academic sector working together to make it happen. We have the great luxury in this region that that's occurring right now. We have to keep that momentum and keep working very, very hard at that, or it will not happen here either, even if we have all the assets to make it happen. And then finally, I will tell you that I think the two biggest challenges that we have overall are, number one, we must grow our population faster than we have been. We need more people moving here, those without jobs. We need more immigration in our region. We need to have more manufacturing workers coming to this area. We need more college graduates coming to this area, and we need to retain the students that we have in this great region. And we need to do that by creating jobs, but we also have to get the word out that this is a great place. The final challenge is this. We have 18,000 jobs, if you go to Ohio Means Jobs, as of today listed there. Great jobs across the spectrum of almost any discipline that you're studying here at this university or any of the universities in our area. And yet we're unable to fill those jobs because either we don't have the skills or they're not paying, something is not matching up. And we have to work incredibly hard to narrow that gap. And when I talk about economic development, I'm an economic developer, and I do this for a living, and I get up every morning thinking about it. But if we're going to be successful, we really need whole rooms of this, students and faculty and business people to think of economic development as their job as well. So I appreciate your attention and you taking an evening to hear some of these comments and take the time to have a dialogue with us tonight. Thank you.
Well, I would like to ask our panelists whether they had any questions for each.
For Jim, so when we is this so my question would be, is it a case that internationally recoveries or the depth of the recession have been exacerbated in countries that also experienced housing slumps like we did, or no?
I'm not so sure about that. I think when you look at some parts of Western Europe, I think that seems to have possibly been the case. I think that was probably the case in Ireland, perhaps.
Yeah.
So some of the other parts of, I think there was a little bit of a housing bubble and burst in Spain and Portugal.
Yeah. But as far as you know, like East Asia never had these sorts of bubbles, or?
Well, that's kind of the interesting question. It seems as if, from kind of the anecdotal evidence I've heard, I haven't looked at hard numbers, that China is going through a bit of a bubble phase
Right now.
in housing right now. And so the question is their economy going to be prone to some of the same weaknesses that burst our bubble 4 or 5 years ago?
I have a question for maybe either one of you. There seems to be a really big mismatch between the confidence of people, consumers, and companies, company leaders. And maybe car sales this last quarter or month or two has shown us that people are actually getting more confident and willing to make discretionary purchases. But company leaders, when surveyed, are extraordinarily skittish. How do you make sense of those two things at the same time? And who's right?
So I can try to answer that. So I mean, consumer sentiment has not been all that great in the recovery, and I think the reason for that, and it's improving, like you said, and I think the reason for that is this sort of rebalancing of your balance sheet that I was alluding to when I was talking about. Now, in terms of companies, I mean, I don't know, I'm not a really micro guy, but it seems to me like anecdotally you hear a lot of companies that have a lot of cash on hand, and they're also sort of skittish in putting it out there. In particular, you hear about these not shenanigans, they're all legal things, you know, cash abroad versus cash in the U.S., how those things differ. So I'm not that sure if there's a big difference between sort of sentiment in the corporate and in the household sector, and if there's a big difference in sort of putting your money out there. I mean, from where I stand, I think they're both. So both sectors, the households and the corporations, are being skittish right now. So that's my impression.
And I would hedge, and I would say that to some degree they're both right, because I think, you know, as Pedro showed, that there are lots of reasons for optimism. The increases in investment, for example, that you showed. Elsewhere, if you look deeper into the employment numbers, one of the things that's been holding back the economy is job losses in the public sector, whereas the private sector has in reality done better than the overall numbers tend to show. And so I think the skittishness, in my view, comes back to this, you know, maybe in a very specific way, the fiscal cliff, but maybe in a broader way, kind of some degree of policy uncertainty and institutional uncertainty about, not that any specific policy is better or worse than another, but just the uncertainty as to, what's going to happen 6 months from now in terms of, what changes are we going to face from a policy perspective that are going to affect business.
So I have a question for Pedro. On one of your slides, you've shown investment as weakening. So first it fell off the cliff right at the recession, then it had a nice recovery, but then now it's slowly coming down. What do you see as the main reason?
Right. So let me just first say that that's just one particular component of investment, right? So that's sort of big ticket items that are not, not defense or aircraft. So that doesn't include like residential investment, things like that, which, haven't been doing all that well either. No, so going back, so going back to what James was saying, when you see some sort of retrenching in these sort of long-term spending. So these are all sort of big ticket items, compared to a household, you're thinking, buying a house, buying a, TV, cars, etc. So these are all big ticket items. So people respond a lot to uncertainty when it comes to purchasing these items. And right now, where we're standing, I mean, we don't know what households don't know, businesses don't know exactly what tax code they're going to be facing in 6 months, say. So I think a lot of that retrenchment has to do with like James was saying, policy uncertainty, and it's just saying, hold on. I mean, is this recovery for real? So a lot of what's happening also is, and this is something that James talked about, the world itself, starting in Europe, and now it seems to be spreading like China, is about to maybe hit a global recession. So firms, especially multinational firms, are sort of saying, let's cool down over here. These are sort of multi-year investments. We need to think about what we're doing here.
Any more questions? Well, I would like to open it up to the floor. If you have any questions. If you have a question, please raise your arm, and then somebody will bring you a microphone.
This is a question for Dr. Bang. I noticed that you didn't include Western Europe in your as a world area in your analysis. Was it included in your overall world estimations? And if so, why was it not listed individually? And if not, why did you not include it?
My primary focus in terms of what I know and what I'm familiar with is developing economies. And so I'm a little bit less knowledgeable as to some of the details of what's going on in Western Europe. What I know is mostly from what's going on in the news. But yeah, I mean, they have been going through similar types of difficulties. But the reasons for their difficulties are not necessarily linked to what's going on in the United States. Like Pedro was saying, what they've been going through the last 2 or 3 or 4 years is kind of unique to their own institutional arrangements with the euro. And maybe not quite as dependent on the U.S. as some of the developing regions that I looked at in my slides were.
This reminds me of something. I told Gore and Alice I'd be happy to take any European debt crisis questions you guys have out there, so I can field those.
This is a question for you, but it's probably not a European debt question. The CBO has said that if we go over the fiscal cliff, we will have a recession in 2013. But the Fed's outlook doesn't seem to reflect that. Does that mean that the Fed disagrees, or does that mean that they think a miracle will occur and Congress will get its act together?
Right. So the Fed's forecasts that I showed you have implicit in them that we're not going to go over the fiscal cliff. So in particular, so the CBO, like you mentioned, actually issues a myriad of forecasts. One which is the complete fiscal cliff, which has sort of a 4% downturn in 2013. But then they also have alternative scenarios. And, whether we like it or not, I think the odds are that we're going to live through one of those alternative scenarios where some of the tax cuts that were supposed to sunset are not going to sunset, some of the discretionary spending cuts are going to be in place, some are not. So I think the truth is going to lie somewhere in between. It's going to depend on what the political wrangling gets us. So you're totally correct. The forecasts you saw and the FOMC forecasts have implicit in them that some sort of arrangement's going to be in place that we're not going to go over the fiscal cliff. Otherwise, now I'm just talking about my own opinion. I agree with the CBO that we will definitely have a recession next year if the law, if the fiscal law is as it stands right now, and we have, namely we let the so-called Bush tax cuts sunset, the AMT extension sunset, the unemployment benefits go away, the across-the-board discretionary spending kicks in. Yeah, I do think we're in for a 3 or 4% decline in GDP.
So I have a question maybe direct towards Pedro. As you can see now, there's the presidential election campaign. The two candidates give out two different economic platforms, I guess. So I wonder, how would you see the election impact the economy, and how would you see the potential outcomes would impact the economy for next year or next cycle?
So my capacity as a Fed employee, I can't comment on that. But like I was answering before, I think it's all going to hinge on the sort of fiscal cliff associated negotiations. So the candidates have fiscal programs that are out there, for better or for worse. Now, of course, privately I have an opinion on what they are, but I wouldn't feel comfortable commenting on any of the programs. But a lot of it's going to be politics and not just economics. Starting right now in the lame duck session. So it's going to be complicated. But from a more sort of helicopter view of things, it seems like it's not that we've exhausted our options on the monetary policy side. There's still some more things we can do, but it just seems that it's incumbent on the fiscal side to sort of start moving. And we understand that the political process is complicated, and that's probably the reason why things haven't been enacted so far. But it's going to be the January showdown. I guess it's going to be like February. They're going to kick the can down the road a little bit more, but we'll see. It's going to be some interesting months coming up.
I can give you a little, just anecdotally, two perspectives of, I think, how communities are looking at this and how the company executives that we work with are looking at this. So the company executives feel a lot like the communities. It's up to us, and we're going to forge ahead. And in many of the industries that we're working with, they're saying, okay, I've held my cash for long enough. I've either got to grow, or I'm going to have to buy back my stock or something. I'm going to take action, and irregardless of who's elected, something will have to break one way or the other. But I can't wait any longer, and I have to keep moving ahead. From the community side, I think you hear more and more people both writing about this and putting it into practice, that they're moving farther ahead. Now, they're doing so very prudently, but they're saying it's up to us to go make this happen. So we could wait for Washington, but that's probably not the greatest strategy, in that we're looking more to our state leadership, and we're looking more to our community leadership, and more to our public-private partnerships to take action and to move things forward. And the real economic activity you see is people doing that, and partnering at a local level. So a recent speaker we had, the editor of Time Magazine, Rana Faruhar, has spoken a lot about this global strategy, and how communities are really moving forward and private sector people locally are moving forward. That's what we see on the ground on that.
Thank you. There's a question here. I don't know if this was touched on, but we have a national debt.
Yeah, thank you. Is that better? There's a national debt that is pretty much astronomical, and just wondering what any three of you think once America has to be accountable for that. We don't seem to be reducing it, let alone we don't seem to be adding to it, let alone reducing it. So, what happens when that does become evident that we may not pay it back or becomes a problem?
So I can say that. So from an international perspective, our debt to GDP ratio is pretty much under control, but it is astronomical. In absolute terms, it is an astronomical debt. But the way I like to think about it is, what are the people on the other side, the guys that are sort of lending us the money, thinking? And what are they thinking? Well, they're thinking 2%, 1% interest rates. Right? So that tells me that they think we're still good for our money. We, the U.S. Now, I don't mean so this is a Treasury problem. It's not the Fed, obviously. Obviously, we in the current path that we are, especially with entitlement spending, health spending, etc., we're pretty soon going to be in a non-sustainable debt path, and that's what we need to concern ourselves with. Obviously, if we fall off the fiscal cliff, and pardon me for saying, that's going to help a lot, because that's gonna decrease a lot. But even falling off the fiscal cliff, and now I'm referring to the CBO projections this gentleman here was talking about, even falling off of the fiscal cliff, that's going to help us for 10 years. But then if we don't curb health spending, Medicare spending in particular, then CBO projections get us to 100, 110% in 2035. And at that point, that servicing with the increase in interest rates that eventually the economy is going to go through, that servicing is going to constitute a huge slice of our budget here. Which right now it's really small because we borrow at very low interest rates. So the key is, in my opinion, here is we need to think about what we as a country want to do about entitlements. We need to sit down and think about how do we want to live, and that's going to be in the voting poll is going to tell us that. This election is going to tell us how do we want to live in terms of debt going forward, right? And the people are going to speak, and Congress is going to meet, et cetera, et cetera. I think the big question facing the U.S. is what do we want to do about our health system right now? That's the big all the other stuff is all the other spending is sort of sideshow for the most part. Medicare is the big ticket issue here, and that's the central question we need to tackle. And I guess the American people are gonna say what they we want Medicare to do this or we want Medicare to do that, and we'll know.
So, a couple things that I mostly agree with Pedro. A couple things to add is to, first of all, we need to kind of get a perspective on what the government is and what the government does. And if you look at about 2/3 of spending by the U.S. government, it's basically Medicare, Social Security, and defense, right? So if you want to think of the government as an analogy, it's basically an insurance company with an army. So basically, if you think about, how do you want to handle the debt? Well, a lot of it has to do with us and how we perceive what the government does for us or to us or whatever you want to think about it. So, either we as voters have to decide that we want less goodies, which we don't, we want more goodies, or we want to pay higher taxes, which we don't, we want to pay lower taxes. So we kind of want to have it both ways. And so there's kind of a political economy problem there where the politics of it isn't good. That's one problem with the debt, right, is that nobody really has an incentive to do anything realistically to control either the spending or the revenue in a way that would actually reduce the debt. The second thing is, which kind of relates to the international aspect, is that if if you think about what the debt is, it's both a liability and an asset, in the sense that we owe the debt, but most of the debt that we owe is to ourselves. The Fed holds a lot of the debt, the banking system holds a lot of the debt, and private individuals hold a lot of the debt. I don't know, what, about 2/3? 60 to 65%?
Yeah, about 60, about 60, about 56.
What is more concerning about what's been going on in the last 3 or 4 years is that a growing share of that debt has been owned by foreigners. And that's one of the aspects that's kind of contributed, I think, to some of the problems in places like Greece and Spain. If you look at the debt burden in Spain or Greece, it's actually much lower as a percentage of their GDP than the United States' debt. But the real problem there is that, number one, a lot of that debt was held by foreign entities, namely Germany, in the case of Greece, and that they didn't have their own currency, right? So one of the things that we have in the United States, for example, when you look at state debt, is that we have a federal authority, a fiscal unit, right? We have a federal government that effectively will bail out states that have debt. And the euro area doesn't have that, and that's why some of their debt problems have been more severe than ours, despite the higher debt burden in the U.S.
Thank you.
So while the unemployment rate did drop for September, considering how many people have dropped out of the labor force, how is that going to affect the economy as it goes forward when those people try and find jobs again? What is the long-term effect of this going to be?
Right. So that's a very good question. So the crux of the question is the unemployment rate a good measure of what we consider to be health in the labor market? And economists like to think that it's not really a good measure. That's why they look at the employment numbers. And a particularly good measure is employment to population ratios. All right? So basically that tells you how many people are working as a percentage of the overall population. If you look at that measure, that's been so it dropped precipitously from, say, I don't know, but maybe it's like 62, 63% to 58, 59 now, and it's been very stagnant throughout the recovery. So you don't see a big recovery if you look at the employment to population ratio. But now you got to think about, things get more complicated as we move along. Now you got to think about, well, what's happening to the population? The population is getting older. Right? So instead of thinking about the employment to population ratio, you want to consider the employment to sort of active population, say the people between 16 and 65. Now, if you look at that alternatively, then you see a little bit of a recovery. But, but something that's small, I'd say that in terms of speed, it's smaller than the decrease in the unemployment rate. So again, on that end, the labor market seems to be on a very protracted recovery path. In terms of the long-term implications of the people that are gonna sort of in the future look for jobs, things look pretty dismal. So I don't know how familiar you guys are with this sort of debate, sort of a labor literature, international debate, which is this, Europe usually is considered to have sclerotic labor markets, where unemployment durations are, historically very long, while the U.S. is a more dynamic labor market, where, people go unemployed, but they go on sort of small unemployment spurts, get back to work. That's been totally shattered in this last recession experience, where now unemployment durations in the U.S. have ballooned to European levels, and you see sort of skill losses and skills getting eroded as you're staying out of a job and possibly out of the labor force. So that's something we need to concern ourselves with in sort of re-educating or training these people to get back onto the labor force. It's a very serious problem.
There's a back and forth between both growth, the rate of growth, and jobs. So I often think, even though our primary goal is job growth, we've got to keep in mind that actual value growth is important too. That's why we think capital investment is also a critical asset. So those jobs that we do create, the companies that we do have operating or making more profitable by doing things like doubling our exports from the U.S. or from our metro regions is really, really important. Getting our growth rate higher and higher is critical to solve some of the national problems. At a community level, the jobs really, really matter, right? So to have healthy families and healthy communities, you have to have jobs for lots of social reasons as well as economic reasons. And so I would just caution everybody, think about both, because growth is critical to solving some of these bigger federal problems.
Yeah, there's a question here.
Yeah, I'd like to ask Pedro a question about monetary policy. We've heard about fiscal policy, and maybe you kind of talked around treasury policy a little bit. Just there, I would throw in the argument that we can probably sell US debt at negative rates of return right now, so shouldn't we actually be piling on the debt rather than trying to think about cutting back on it? But that's just an aside. The Federal Reserve is, as you obviously know, has just made this commitment to a third round of quantitative easing. And my sense is, compared to QE2 and QE1, that this is much more of a long-term commitment, is my sense. So what I want to know is, what's the objective in terms of changing expectations of this what I think is quite different round of quantitative easing? And if we do change what those expectations are, what do we expect the long-run benefits of quantitative easing to be? I mean, what's the actual objective of this round?
So that's a great question. So let me just give people sort of a little bit of context on what the latest Fed action was in the last FOMC round. So like Ian was saying, the FOMC came out and said, unlike what he had done before, where he said we're going to buy treasuries and we're going to buy MBSs, and this is how much we're going to buy of each. In this last round, the FOMC came out and said, we're going to buy $40 billion of MBSs every month, and we're going to keep on doing it until the economy improves. And if the economy doesn't improve, we're going to buy some more treasuries. So it's sort of we're going to do whatever it takes for the economy to improve, and sort of an open-ended commitment to quantitative easing. So the answer is sort of in two parts. So one aspect of the sort of old quantitative easing, and this is something Ian's question was alluding to, was pointing to, which I think is the direction that he wants me to take this. One aspect of the old sort of quantifiable quantitative easing was, we're going to affect long-term interest rates by buying long-term assets. Now, what we're doing now in terms of open-ended commitment is we want to affect people's expectations. And the reason we want to affect people's expectations is we want to tell people to spend now, right? So in a sense, and this is a debate that's always going on in the Fed, so you can, if you guys read the FOMC minutes, et cetera, there's a lot of information, a wealth of information there. So for example, a lot of people defend that the Fed should just say, we're going to accept 3.5% inflation, for example. So the Fed has a commitment, an official commitment to 2% inflation. So some people defend that the Fed should come out and say, for a while, we're going to accept 3.5% inflation. Now, what's that telling people? Well, it's telling them, if you hold on to those dollars are going to devalue faster now. So you better spend them now. So this is the sort of expectation that we want to change. Of course, we don't want to do it by telling people we're going to accept higher inflation, which is something we definitely don't want. It took us a long time to get people's goodwill, right, to say, we commit to 2%, and this is what we do. We don't want to waste that sort of capital. So we're never going to say something like, we accept higher inflation. We are committed to 2% inflation. So to change people's expectations, we instead move in the sort of through the balance sheet and say, we're going to keep on buying, we're going to keep on easing, right, until we see some improvement. Now the question is, what is that improvement? How can you quantify it? So the Fed was pretty sort of vague about that, and they're also, and this is public information, there's debates around the FOMC on what sort of language should we use. Should we use like a date language, like we're going to keep interest rates low until mid-2015? Or should we have a target, for example, that tells the public, we're going to keep on quantitative easing until some unemployment number comes in, some GDP growth number comes in, something like that. But basically, you're right. We want to. So the goal here is to change people's future expectations, and in the sort of move them to, when I say people, I mean households and corporations, obviously. Do your spending now. Do your consumer spending, your investment spending now.
I realize this is an outlook conference, and it's hard to go against the general current, as we've heard some global and some national and then some local commentary. But my question would be, from the things we've heard tonight, are there any ways we can apply this, or any things we can do? Because we only live here. We only live wherever we live. So what are the things that we could take and maybe take action on, maybe from the comments that we've heard tonight from you guys?
This is what I end most of my talks saying, which is, if everybody in a community, and when I refer to a community, I'm talking about an entire region, has their radar on about what's really happening around them, the companies that are expanding, and are connecting the dots between their neighbors and some of the business individuals in the community, some really good things can happen. If they then know how to connect them with the resources that can make things happen, financial institutions, academic institutions, even better things can happen. So we're constantly making connections. We were talking about the alumni network, for example, this evening at dinner. We have over 54 college campuses across our 11 counties. And collectively, we have the largest, one of the largest alumni networks in the world, with thousands and thousands of people that actually run companies around the world that have a connection to our area. How are we making connections to them, asking them how to do business in the Columbus region? And anecdotally, that's really where a lot of this stuff actually happens. How did Honda end up in Marysville? So there's a whole story of that from some 33 years ago, but it was some personal connections. How did these companies scale from being in their garage to being some of the largest companies in the world? They didn't, it wasn't just because this was the greatest place in the world. A lot of people really helped along the way that were local, and they made connections, and it was very unique. And so there's a big opportunity there. We have choices to make locally. And I'll give you a great example. There is a campus, an industrial campus now in Licking County, just outside of New Albany, that's termed the Personal Care and Beauty Campus. And I could use another bottle, a Bath and Body Works bottle, and describe an entire industrial park to you. So 18 months ago, it was a raw piece of dirt, and Les Wexner said, we could probably increase the speed of how we do what we do by bringing some of these people that are making the bottle, the label, the cap, and the fill to a lotion bottle to Columbus, Ohio. And I could have them not only collaborate with each other, but I could give them a little extra business if they built their facility here in this region. And so I arrived about that time that they were conceptually talking about it, and it was a raw piece of dirt. And we've helped 9 manufacturing companies locate over 2,000 jobs in an industrial park in our region because somebody was intentional and thoughtful about saying maybe we could do that in our own backyard. And oh, by the way, for those companies, it doesn't just make sense because they get a little bit of business from Limited, but because of our geographic location, that's made them more competitive worldwide companies. 3 of those companies came from outside the United States. And so that's a way that one of our leaders was intentional and thoughtful and helped create jobs in our local arena, and then we had the wherewithal to help make it happen along with them. So it really does matter. Leadership really does matter, and paying attention from whatever seat you sit in really matters. So it does make a difference. None of this is inevitable. I would go home and open a bottle of something if I thought it was. So we can do something about it.
Any closing questions? Please, up front.
I have 2 specific questions. One, we got the unemployment results from the country of Greece today, and they're pretty horrible, with 25% inflation overall, which is the highest in Greece in history, and with the unemployment rate specifically in the young age group between ages 18 to 30 at over 50%, specifically 53.4%. I want to know how that impacts the U.S. economy in the future, and also, is there a potential solution to the Greece crisis by just dismantling the European Union overall and having countries work for themselves?
Go ahead. So a couple of things on that. So I don't, and this is my particular opinion again, I don't think Greece will be better off by leaving the euro, or the eurozone is not going to be better off by dismantling the euro. What the eurozone needs to think about is how fiscal policy is going to work. And there's been positive steps. So the eurozone, in terms of fiscal and monetary policy, is now a lot closer to the U.S. than it was, say, even 2 months ago. So the ECB has come in and said, okay, as long as countries like Greece and Portugal are already out, but countries like Spain and Italy apply for quote-unquote bailouts, we will buy their debt in secondary markets. Okay, so this is basically what, grosso modo, is basically what the Fed has done for the U.S. economy. So the answer is, Europe is doing a lot better than it was even a couple of months ago. There is a solution to the Greek problem. There's not going to be a solution. There's not going to be a painless solution. Just like there's not going to be a painless solution to the debt problem in the U.S. So now the question can be, is the amount of austerity that's going on the indicated amount? Well, I mean, you'll never know. I mean, you listen to one side and they say yes, you listen to another side and say no. And a lot of this, there's no counterfactual, so we don't know what the Greece economy would have been had they left the euro and had they not go through the austerity measures that they're going now, or that Portugal's going through now, or that Ireland's going through now. It's all a matter of degree, how much do you want to tighten that belt? Okay, so the people that are on the wrong side of the belt, they're going to say, it's too tight. And Greek workers in particular have been dealt a rough blow. Did you ask me, is it the right amount? I don't know. I mean, if I would have followed the same way. Quantitatively, I don't know what it is. I mean, you got to feel things as a politician, as an economist. But I do think the Greeks are sort of following the right way. The right way is to stay in the eurozone and go through the pain. Maybe it's too much pain. I agree. I don't know.
Do you have any questions for each other in closing?
No, thank you.
No?
No, thank you.
Well, as one of our panelists said, good things happen when people get together. We got together today, and I think good things happened. We got a little smarter. We understand a little better what has happened and what we can expect. It's reassuring to hear that debt really is not as big of a problem as the media is overblowing it.
Is that what you think?
I did get that, yes, and I agree with you. And last year's panelist said that one of our panelists said he couldn't believe that politicians are making this into a problem when it was not. I completely agree with you. I like that I have heard the expression "insurance company with an army." I have to call my State Farm agent to get an army. And then it's good to hear that returns to human capital are increasing. That's why we're here. We're in the business of education. Whether we want to call it business of education or not, we can question that, but we are here to provide education service, and it seems that returns to that are increasing in our globalized world, so we seem to be in a good place. I'd like to thank our panelists for taking their time, coming here, sharing their stories and opinions. I would like to thank the audience for coming and staying here till the end. See you next year.